you know, when we talk about listening, we're really talking about all our senses picking up a whole bunch of input and bringing it into us. So, you know, when I reference listening, I'm talking about things we're seeing, things we're hearing, things we might smell, things we're touching, and we're bringing all that raw data into us, into our conscious mind, and then we're using our experience and our knowledge and our, you know, insights to process that, and we're processing that into a more refined sort of product, which are our insights that are going to, you know, move us for the next step. So if we hear, you know, a sound in an environment that sounds out of place, so that's going to resonate with us, and we're going to have to process that, and we have to decide what to do about that. Maybe we'll do nothing, maybe we'll do something. So talking about listening, you know, I would divide listening into 3 distinct categories, and those 3 categories really delineate where the source of what's communicating with us is, where it's coming from, because that makes a difference. So the classic listening that, you know, we'll start with is listening to someone else. You're in a conversation with someone, you're listening to them. So they've taken, I'll just clarify one point before we continue. People talk a lot about reality, like what's your reality, you know, and I find it to be quite a loaded term. It's often used, it's often weaponized a little bit, used against someone. I say, you know, get with reality, or you know, you don't understand reality. And it's just, what does that mean anyway? Like, what's someone really saying when they talk about reality like that? So I don't like to use reality. I'm going to talk about what people commonly refer to as reality in a different way. I'm going to refer to it as our objective truth and our subjective truth. They're both truths. The objective truth within us is what we see in the world, for example, a tree, a house, someone else's emotion. Someone else's emotion is to us an objective truth. It exists in the world. It's a fact. We take it inside us if we choose to. We take someone else's emotion inside us, and that then becomes our subjective truth. We're then experiencing that ourselves. It's passed through whatever triggers of experience and knowledge we've got, and it becomes maybe something different within us. But someone else expressing emotion to us, for example, that's an objective truth to us.
We have let me just see if I get this over here. So this is beautiful. So when we talking about listening, and we're talking about experiences, and you have an objective truth, which is like a tree, or you mentioned like a house, or like an emotion. And say, for example, I see someone, I don't know, smashing a plate, right? Which is an example you've used before. That emotion, it goes through my triggers, and if I absorb that, or when I absorb that, I that comes into me through my senses, that is subjective, correct?
Right. Like let's say 2 people see somebody very angry, you know, throwing a plate against the wall and smashing a plate.
Okay.
That's an objective truth in the world that exists in the same way for all 10 people who are watching that. They all see the same thing. It's an objective truth. Nobody can argue against what just happened. But those people, depending on their past experience, you know, maybe some have experienced violence in the past, or abuse, or who knows, but depending on a person's experience, if one of them's a police officer, if one of them is a therapist, they're going to have their own experience and knowledge, which are going to act as triggers within them that will turn that experience, that objective truth, into unique experiences of subjective truth within each person. So my subjective truth, seeing that smashed plate, might be very different from your subjective truth. They're both truths. They're truths that exist inside each one of us, but they're different. So that whole scene is comprised of, you know, the reality of that scene is comprised of 2 halves for every person. It's the objective truth of what happened in the world, which is the same objective truth for all those people. And it's each person's unique subjective truth that's affected by all their triggers, the knowledge, their experience, their own emotions, etc. And that's different for everyone. And it's a truth. It's the subjective truth within them, which also, it's not a matter of judging it. It can't be disputed. It's a truth that exists within a person.
Right.
Is it damaging? Maybe. Is it unhealthy? Maybe. Might it lead to someone else getting hurt down the track? Maybe, but that doesn't change or impact its status as the subjective truth within them. So that is the reality in that situation. It's comprised of those two halves of objective truth and subjective truth within the person. So when we're talking about listening, we're really talking about a process of taking objective truth in from outside us into our conscious mind through our own triggers, where it becomes our subjective truth. That's listening. And there are basically three different forms that can take. When we're listening to someone else, so they have they take an objective truth that goes through their mind, gets processed through their subjective truth into something different, which then they project to us. And we take their subjective truth, that becomes our objective truth. So if someone is angry, their anger is their subjective truth, but it's our objective truth. It's a fact of the world that comes from inside them subjectively, but we take it to us as an objective truth that exists in the world. And then it gets processed by our own subjective truth into something personal to us. So that's the listening process when we're talking about listening to someone else with a conscious mind who has their own subjective truth that's changing objective truth that they experience, and it passes through their subjective truth, and it turns into something different that we then take inside us. So there's a much more complicated process going on when you're listening to other people. A much more simple process of listening is when you're listening to an environment. So a car, if a person hears something in their environment, a loud noise from a car, for example, there's no subjective truth with that car. That car doesn't have a conscious mind that's changing things that you're trying to understand about an objective fact in the world. It's just a car and it's doing something. So if a person's just walking a street and they hear a sound that's really out of place from a car, maybe there's a red light and they hear a car engine accelerating when it should be slowing down towards that red light, they hear that. So that now they've heard something that stuck out to them, but that's just an objective truth in the world. So when they're listening to that and they hear that, they're literally just taking a simple objective truth in through their triggers into their mind, and now they're going to process that. So the whole extra level of processing that's required when you're dealing with another person who has their own internal subjective reality, that doesn't exist when you're dealing with a car or a tree or something like that. It's just that thing that you're trying to understand.
Because it's not going to respond back to you.
Yeah, there's no extra layer of truth that you're trying to get behind when you're dealing with an object as opposed to dealing with another person. Because dealing with that person, and again, this is going to depend on what the goal is. When you're dealing with another person, let's say another person is very angry and they're communicating with you and they're really expressing a lot of anger to you. So what's the goal? What are you trying to achieve by listening to them? If you really need, if the goal is to validate them, meaning you'd like to help them, they're in a challenging emotional state, and you'd like to help them calm down. You'd like to help them regulate their emotion. So the facts, the objective truth behind that emotion, what caused the emotion, what fact happened, what led to it, it's less important because you're dealing with the subjective truth of their emotion.
What's inside of them, yeah.
Your goal is to affect that subjective truth inside them. You want the subjective truth of their emotion to change. You want to help them with that. What caused that emotion behind that, the objective truth? Somebody said something to them and it caused them to be very angry. What was it that was said? It might not matter because you're dealing with the anger, which is the subjective truth of that person. But if your goal in that situation, let's say there's an emergency and you need an address, you need to send an emergency response, a police or ambulance or whatever. You need to find out an address to send a vehicle. That's an objective truth. So the emotion's less important. You don't care about the emotion in that moment. That's not your goal. You don't need to validate that person and help them to feel better. At that point in time, that's not the goal. The goal is to get behind that anger, to get behind that emotion, to the objective truth behind that, which is they know an address, you need that address. So you're not focusing on helping them feel better. You're focusing on, how do I get that address? You might need to work with their emotion in order to get behind it. But your goal's not to resolve their emotional state in that moment. Your goal is, I need that address and I need it now. How am I going to get that?